Good evening, everyone. I'm Brady Quinn, a junior criminal justice cyber criminology major and a Kevin B. Harrington student ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Tonight, we'd like to welcome you to the first in-person event that is open to the general public the New Hampshire Institute of Politics has hosted since the pandemic. It's exciting. We are also Zooming this event. After our comments tonight, we will be open for a Q&A session. For those that are in the audience, there'll be a microphone passed around. But for anyone joining us on Zoom, if you use the Q&A function on Zoom, we'll be able to ask your questions that way. And tonight's speaker is Georgia's Lieutenant Governor, Geoff Duncan. He's the author of GOP 2.0, How the 2020 Election Can Lead to a Better Way Forward for America's Conservative Party. A former baseball player and successful entrepreneur, Lieutenant Governor Duncan's faith inspired him to a life of leadership and prompted his upstart run for political office, first serving in Georgia's House of Representatives and being elected to Lieutenant Governor in 2018. Since his inauguration in January of 2019, he has established himself as a bold leader and champion for healthcare, technology, and economic development. His business experience and outlook allows him to bring a common sense, private sector experience and approach to state government. Lieutenant Governor Duncan is here today to share his book, GOP 2.0, which is an independent movement that brings a fresh and reasoned approach to creating Republican majorities through the PET project, which works on creating better policy, empathy, and tone within the Republican Party. Please join me in welcome Lieutenant Governor Geoff Duncan.
Thank you, Brady. I appreciate that introduction, and it is such an honor to be here this evening at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics and on this beautiful campus. Neil, I want to thank you for taking us on a tour of the area. What an amazing, just the political weight here is just phenomenal, and so thank you for this opportunity to be here. I want to take a minute and just take a second to reflect on the life and legacy of Colin Powell. If we could, in a day and age where there's so many people noted for their divisiveness, Colin Powell is going to be reflected all around this world as an authentic leader and as somebody who was a statesman and had the ability to rise above all. And so I didn't want to move on with my comments until taking that opportunity to reflect on Colin Powell. I want to take a second to thank my wife for being here with me this evening. My wife, Brooke, so yesterday we celebrated our 24th wedding anniversary. And in typical Geoff Duncan fashion, I started a couple of weeks ago knowing I had a couple of trips. I knew I had to go from DC last night to New Hampshire to South Carolina tomorrow. I said, Brooke, we're going to go out of town for our anniversary. She's like, great. Where are we going? And I said, well, and I explained the itinerary to her. So I think she quickly knew what it was. But thank you for being here, and thanks for being a great partner in this crazy journey that we're on. It's great to be back in New Hampshire. Probably nobody knows this, but I used to live in New Hampshire in the early 80s in Windham. My parents moved here from Western Pennsylvania, and my dad worked in Boston and my mom worked in Nashua. And then later in life, I actually had another opportunity through baseball to spend a lot of time in the Northeast. And one of those stops was the Portland Sea Dogs, which obviously isn't very far. And now staying at the hotel that we're at with the team in left field, the Fisher Cats. I would have, if I was much younger, I'd be playing there still. But also had an opportunity to play in the Cape Cod League. And I played for the Yarmouth Dennis Red Sox. So great opportunity to play baseball around here. But probably the biggest asset for me in the Northeast is that we sent two really good, now who's a Boston Red Sox fan? Okay, so more than the average crowd I walk into. We sent two really good baseball players up here. I had the opportunity to play at Georgia Tech to play baseball. And we sent Nomar Garcia Parra up here, if anybody's old enough to remember Nomar, and also this guy named Jason Veritek. At the risk of maybe running a little long, I'm gonna tell a funny story about Jason Veritek. So I show up on campus at Georgia Tech as a freshman. And of course, you know, freshman athletes, you think you know everything. You've been really good your whole life, but then you show up on campus. And so the first inter-squad game against our own team, I get Jason to pop up to the third baseman. And I spent the next 3 days telling all the other freshmen how easy it was. He was probably a little overrated. And my stuff was better than his stuff. And somehow word got back to him. And so 3 or 4 days later, I show back up on the mound and I'm pitching against Jason Veritek. And I learned 2 very important things that day. He walked out to out of the on-deck circle and he turned around and told the dugout, I'm going to teach this kid a lesson. And he did 2 lessons. One is don't throw him a first pitch fastball. He hit it about 500 feet off of a fraternity house in right field. And the second lesson was humility, because he never even ran to first base. He just turned around and walked back to the dugout. Now, there's a mixed message what he actually said walking back, but I'm certain none of them were an invitation to church. As was mentioned, I'm the 12th lieutenant governor of the state of Georgia. And it's you know, Georgia's probably a little unknown state. Most folks probably never heard of it. It's never in the news these days. Just kidding. We have found our way into the news, but despite what you hear and read on the former president's letterhead, Georgia is putting conservatism on display for our 11 million Georgians. And I'm going to brag for a minute about what we're doing in the great state of Georgia. One, our unemployment rate, much like New Hampshire, is right around 3%, hopefully going to be below 3% shortly. We have raging economic growth kind of all over our state. And I think it's because of intentional investments in education and higher ed and things like the Port of Savannah, which continues to just outperform even the most optimistic expectations. We also have $6 billion in our rainy day fund. And I can't think of a more conservative value to put on display than being able to have the financial discipline, the fiscal discipline to be able to save. I'm relatively new to politics in politics terms. We got elected in 2012 as a state representative, and then in 2019 was sworn in as the lieutenant governor in Georgia. And when I got started, I knew nothing really about politics. It wasn't my thing. I was just busy living the American dream and raising a family and running a business. And I thought that was my biggest political liability, was the fact that I didn't have any political experience. But what I quickly realized is there was an appetite in Georgia, and especially the district that I lived in, to just hear about my version of the American dream, what I was doing, how I was raising my 3 kids in a public school system, how I was making tough decisions around my businesses. It was the opportunity to put on display, you know, all those life lessons that I was learning like other folks were learning. And so I think also that was recognized was the value of hard work. And I learned that on a baseball field, and that's not a cheesy statement, but I legitimately learned the value of hard work. The harder you work, the more opportunities you get. It doesn't mean you're always going to win. It just means the more opportunities you're going to get. And we knocked on 4,000 doors, made 6,000 phone calls in a little, you know, tightly wound state house district. And we won by a complete landslide, 55 votes. That's a joke. We won by 55 votes, but at the end of the day, it was because we worked hard and we convinced a number of folks to show up and to support us. And it was amazing. It was humbling along the way. I got into the State House and I got to spend 5 very important years, I believe, in the Georgia General Assembly's time working on a number of policy ideas. And I was terrible at the politics because I didn't care about the politics. I was sent there to be a conservative and to put those conservative values on display. And so I drafted 3 really important bills. One was Michael's Law, which directly took on underage drinking across our state. One was the Cargo Theft Act, which took on organized crime. And in 1 year, we lowered cargo theft 68% in the state of Georgia. And the last and probably the most recognizable piece of legislation was the Rural Hospital Tax Credit. We, like many states, have a rural hospital crisis going on, and we can't keep them open, right? There's a broken funding model for rural hospitals. And so I created a tax credit program that allows individuals and corporations to write checks directly to one of those 54 rural hospitals. And in return, you get a dollar for dollar tax credit. So literally overnight when the bill passed, we raised $60 million for 54 rural hospitals. And it really changed the game. It turned away from hospitals looking to just survive to now they had the opportunity to thrive. And so I woke up one day and decided, you know what, I either want to be in charge or go home. I love being in elected office, but I just felt like there was a better way to do business at the Georgia Capitol. And so I put my name in the hat to run for lieutenant governor. Lieutenant governor, the role of lieutenant governor is the president of the Senate. You get to manage the entire legislative process. You really work with selecting who the committee members are, the committees that legislation is assigned to, what bills get pulled forward. It's a pretty important position. And I knew it was one that would allow me to put my policy over politics platform on display each and every day. And that's really what happened. And I was the underdog of all underdogs. It seems to be a theme in my life. But it wasn't something, it was an opportunity for me to meet Georgians, to roll up my sleeves every day and every night and go out and ask them what their challenges were. And it was an incredible opportunity for us. I'd do it again, even if I wouldn't have won the race. I would have run for lieutenant governor. Everything was going according to plan until November 2020. Anybody remembers what happened in November 2020? There was this election. And in Georgia, things happened a little differently than probably what I had scripted. And if I'm being honest, if most Republicans are being honest with themselves, they would all agree that we could hear the warning sirens blaring in the background. We could see an upset coming. It wasn't unexplainable. It was explainable. We didn't want that to happen, but it was explainable as we watched the campaign roll out. One of those stories that I talk a lot about in the book, opening out in the prologue, is this rally in Rome, Georgia. 2 days before the election, the former president shows up in Rome, Georgia, of all places, and has a rally. And certainly there's 20, 30,000, Make America Great hats staring right at you. And I had the opportunity to speak at this rally. And look, I knew the riddle that had to be solved. The riddle was trying to convince not those folks to show back up to vote, but the folks that were watching on TV in the suburbs that were still trying to figure out if they could stomach another time voting for Donald Trump. And so I made the silly mistake of saying our policies are so good as Republicans, they even help the people that don't vote for us. And I got booed. And it was an eye-opener to me. It was an eye-opener that the very recipe for success for us in that election cycle was being booed in that crowd. There was no mystery as to what the Trump strategy was. It was to replicate the 2016 campaign in 2020. And why not? It was very effective. It was very powerful. In 2016, Donald Trump promised that he would be an outsider change agent and he would upset the apple cart right out of the gates. And certainly, I think none of us would argue that happened. Donald Trump promised that he would take on China, and he did. Donald Trump promised that he would appoint conservative Supreme Court justices, and certainly none of us could argue that would be the case. Donald Trump promised to be the voice of all those conservatives that felt like they'd never been heard before, and he certainly did that. And so by all accounts, it was an effective strategy, and he got 12 million more votes to show up in 2020 than 2016. So how'd he lose? At the risk of trying to sound a little smarter than I probably am, my wife would agree. I'm going to quote Sir Isaac Newton. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. When the Yankees come in to Fenway to play the Red Sox, there's more energy in the stadium than there is when the Mariners show up. Donald Trump revved up his base, but he also revved up the other base. 12 million more folks voted for Donald Trump in 2020. 16 million more voted for Joe Biden in 2020 than the Democrats received in 2016. I think there's another interesting issue that's not talked about enough. There's this divide between rural America and suburban America. It's a tug of war of sorts. It's not a war, it's a tug of war. And I get to see it play out at the Georgia Capitol almost every legislative session, because what's good for rural America is rarely good for suburban America. And what's good for suburban America is rarely good for rural America, right? If you reform taxes, it rarely helps both sides of that equation. If you talk about education delivery systems, it's normally not as effective in both areas. You pick healthcare, another issue. And so you've got this tug of war that plays out between rural and suburban. And in 2016, I believe the suburbs gave Donald Trump a hall pass for kind of his rude and crude approach. They said, you know what, we can stomach it if this guy's going to come in and do the things he's got to do. We can stomach this just long enough. The problem was that disappeared in 2020. The suburbs no longer could justify when they walked into that boardroom or into that office or into that church or onto that ball field how and why they supported Donald Trump. And so that was, we watched this play out in Georgia in several different fashions. Another important point to make here is that the greatest campaign slogan maybe in the history of this country was drain the swamp. It was the most effective, get your attention, make a point very, very quickly. You had no mistaking what he meant when he said drain the swamp. The realities are it feels a lot like he might have fed the swamp. At $7.8 trillion in additional national debt during that period of time, some of that COVID related, but definitely not all of it. Those fiscal conservatives that showed up to vote for him, despite some other challenges that they might have had with Donald Trump, decided not to vote for him. So you add all that up, the summary is Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, and we felt that in Georgia probably harder than any other state. It was several elements of that in angles. You had the presidential race, and certainly all of that well-documented fallout with the energy put behind trying to get us to overturn the election and hold a special session and do all those crazy things. It just didn't make sense. But you also had a Senate runoff that just immediately started right after that. And so this hyper focus of national attention on not just the balance of Republican leadership in Georgia, but of course for the entire country in the Senate. You also began to, almost within hours, watch party infighting happen. You watch factions forming, folks that were always supportive of each other within the same communities, within the same GOP groups, within the same delegations, start throwing arrows at each other publicly, privately. And probably the most disconcerting thing for me in those 10 weeks after the election, and unfortunately continues to this day, is just the infighting inside our communities. You can't go to the grocery store without somebody digging in on one side of the issue or another side of the issue. It's at the ball fields, it's in our schools, it's in our own homes. It's not the pathway forward, I can tell you, for a party or for a country. So I was very aggressive early and often about speaking against the fraud, not because I just didn't want to look to see if there was fraud. I spent all the time in the world talking to the Attorney General's office, the investigators, the governor's office, the Secretary of State's office. I was doing all the due diligence I could to figure out if there was any sort of systemic fraud in that election. And the answer every day was no. We never could find any fraud. We could never find any secret tidbit that would help us figure out that the election was rigged, because it wasn't. I started down this path of speaking to the media, and I thought I was going to be amongst a Republican choir. But unfortunately, it was that scary moment when you realize you're on stage singing a solo. And I told my story, and I told it for a couple of different reasons, but one, and primarily because I wanted to be honest. I thought honesty was the best pathway forward for the Republican Party. I thought long-term, that trust we could build with America, and when the short-term sugar high of a fake news around a rigged election wore off, we'd be in a better, stronger position to come back. I also had confidence in the fact that this number, 53.7% of Georgians voted for a Republican state senator. 49.5% voted for a Republican president. Unless this was the most organized, quiet conspiracy theory that spanned parties and global nations, then it was just 53.7% of Georgians wanted a Republican state senator, and 49.5% of Georgians wanted Donald Trump to be their president. The attacks started almost immediately. It was unbelievable to watch the way this played out. I would go on TV. I would say something fact-based. I would say something like, unfortunately, the Republicans did not win this race, and Joe Biden is going to be the president-elect. And within minutes of leaving the studio, I'd get a tweet from the president, would tweet at me. And then within minutes, my wife and I both would receive threats on our phone. And it just was a vicious cycle that just continued over and over and over again, to the point where the State Patrol had to bring troopers out to our house 24/7. They weren't protecting me against terrorists. They weren't protecting me against criminals. They were protecting me against Republicans. At some point in the midst of this whole storm, I decided, in the ultimate fixer mode that my wife says I like to go into, I started to draft down a plan. Hey, when this Trump fever breaks, when this storm is past us, what is a plan for us as Republicans to win again? How do we get back to the basics? And so I started to, literally like a startup business, draft a plan on a piece of paper and start to develop it. And before you know it, it literally became GOP 2.0. It quickly became a 501c4 organization that it's not a new party. This is just a better pathway forward for our party, for our conservative party. And the book here that we're speaking about tonight is part of that journey. It's a catalyst. It gives me an excuse to be in important rooms like this all over the country in the coming years to try to influence these races. If done right, GOP 2.0 is going to be a safe place to call home for common sense conservatives. It's going to allow us to win on the policy front but it's also going to allow us to win on the ballot boxes. And the interesting thing is this. I get very little pushback about GOP 2.0, even from the most ardent Trump supporters. Right? Folks that are hook, line, and sinker, out there tweeting, out there making public statements on their support for Trump. They don't even push back on the notion that GOP 2.0 can win, because it can. They push back on the timing of it. Say, well, it's just not there yet. You're going to need to let the former president just off-gas this a little longer. Folks, we've only got 3 years if you're a Republican to try to win back the White House. And I don't doubt that if GOP 2.0 would have been a candidate and run against Joe Biden, we would have won. Our job now as Republicans is to harness all of the good that we've done over the years, all of those great policy positions that make sense for a majority of Americans, and then self-evaluate the things that we need to improve. What can we do better? Right? That's what you do in the boardroom. That's what you do in your own homes. You take what you do well, take what you don't do well, and you make it better. It's starting to feel like the GOP 2.0 is now not only going to have to take on Joe Biden, but it sounds like and feels like we're going to have to take on Donald Trump and their failed strategies. I believe the average American is waking up right now, recognizing the failed leadership of both Trump and Biden. It's painful. I say that more as an American than I do as a partisan. With a few course adjustments, just a few course adjustments and a few sips of medicine, I believe the GOP can get back on track. I talk a lot about in the book, The Pet Project. And Brady, thanks for bringing that up. The Pet Project is a strategy to try to win back the White House, but also to reset the focus of the party on policy, empathy, and tone. Right? I'm not ashamed of the policies that the Republican Party stands for. In fact, we've forgotten to remind people in this last election cycle why they should show up to vote for a Republican. I talk about it in the book, The Policy Prison. I break it up into 3 issues. The core things that we ought to just remind everybody in every room we walk in and out of that Republicans are just simply the best at. Right? I believe a majority of Americans want us in charge of the economy and their future economic opportunities. I believe they want Republicans now more than ever to be in charge of their community's safety. And I believe now more than ever they want Republicans to be in charge of our national security. But also on the policy front, we've got to move our feet. We've got to start to talk about, with conservative tones and overtones, other issues like immigration. Build the Wall was a great project name, but it wasn't a policy reform. I believe in border security. I believe an overwhelming majority of Americans believe in border security. Unfortunately, Joe Biden does not. And that leaves our country in a dangerous position, not just with illegal immigration, but with drug trafficking and human trafficking. But we cannot talk about border security if we're not willing to talk about the 16 million undocumented folks that are in this country. It's time to talk about them. It's time to figure out where we're at, who's embedded in the economy, who's paying taxes, who's part of those communities, who's participating in that community, and who isn't. I think Republicans can lead on that, because if we don't, and we're not willing to, we won't win again. And we'll have no seat at the table and be right where we're at today, with no voice in the Congress, no voice in the Senate, and no voice in the White House. The E is for empathy. This is sometimes hard to explain, so I just break it out in a very simple analogy. Empathy is sitting down at that single mom's kitchen table that's got two kids and 2 jobs. Instead of telling her she needs to vote for you, asking her what you could do to help her. And you might be surprised if you ask what the answer might be. She's going to tell you something like, just make my neighborhood safer for my kids and make their schools better performing. You know, we as Republicans are really good at that. I think we can step in and do that. Empathy is not about running the right ad at the right time in the election cycle and expecting somebody to show up to vote for you. We can do better with empathy. We can expand the size of the tent because we want to, because we want additional perspective. We need to play more offense than defense when it comes to growing the size of our tent. The T is tone, and I could go on for hours. I'd probably talk into the first pitch of the Red Sox game if I talked about tone, told you everything I thought. But simply put, I just wish Donald Trump would have put his phone down. Right? How many times do we hear that? Tone matters. Leaders, good, strong leaders have good tone. They don't avoid press questions in the White House when there's a crisis, and they don't take 280 characters on Twitter to make a point. There's only 3 years to win back the White House. It's got to start now. But we got to have the right people to throw the right pitch at the right time. In the book, I tell this great story, and I certainly didn't start this journey thinking I was going to talk about a bunch of cheesy minor league baseball stories, but they just happened to mean a lot when I started writing. There was a player. I was in the minor league camp. I was actually going to go off to play for the Portland Sea Dogs, and we were in Florida, in Vieira, Florida, in spring training, and I was in the minor league complex. And I walk into my locker one day, and it was pretty boring being in the minor leagues, right? It really wasn't like all the flash and glamour of the big leagues. And there was a note in my locker, and it said, "Geoff, report to the big league stadium for today's game. You're going to be on the roster." And of course, I thought it was one of my buddies playing a trick on me. And so I sat there for a couple of minutes trying to figure out who did it, but it really was. They got an invitation to go up to the big league team for one spring training game. And so I jump on the golf cart and I drive to the big league stadium, and I walk in the locker room, and I was just in awe, right? I mean, here I had half these guys' baseball cards underneath my bed still, right? I was a fanboy. I felt like the bat boy. But sure enough, I looked over and I saw my number and my name on the back of a jersey, so I knew I was in the right place. And I go down to the bullpen and I wait for the game, and I was a late inning reliever guy. So about the eighth inning, the phone rings and they said, "Get Duncan loose." I get loose in a couple of pitches, and I jog into the game, and we're playing the Mets. And I dreamed about this my whole life, so I knew exactly the way this was going to go. I was going to strike out the side. I was going to go in the dugout. I was going to sign a multi-million-dollar contract after the game, and the rest was written. Y'all would never know my name in politics. So first pitch, just a screaming line drive to right field. I mean, this guy just laced the ball. First pitch. And I was like, he's got lucky, right? Just beginner's luck. Second pitch, same thing. Guy hits a just screaming line drive to right field. I was like, okay, these guys are a little better than maybe what I thought. I'll nibble a little bit. I'll throw a little more towards the corners. And so I walked the next guy. So here I am, bases loaded, no outs. Exactly what I had not dreamed about my entire life. Knees knocking the whole 9 yards, right? Like doubting, like I should have got out of baseball when I was in Little League. I get set on the mound, and the announcer says, "Now batting, the first baseman, John Olerud." And I don't know if anybody's old enough to know who John Olerud is in the room, but at the time in the late 90s, he was probably the best hitter in baseball. He was 6'8", left-handed, and he looked like, a lumberjack in there. And he comes up to bat, and I get him 3 balls and 2 strikes. Catcher calls timeout, and he jogs out to the mound, and he says, "Hey, rookie, you know how to throw a changeup?" I said, "Yeah, I practiced it my entire life. I can throw a changeup." He's like, "All right, throw him a changeup." I said, "Why?" "It's like my third best pitch." He said, "Because if you throw a fastball, he's going to rip your head off." So sure enough, he jogs behind the plate with all that vote of confidence. I throw a 3-2 changeup, and just what the doctor ordered. He was about an inch out in front on his front foot, pops it up to the shortstop. 1 out. Next guy, ground ball, double play, inning over. That was the most glorified walk from that mound to the dugout I've ever felt in my life. Like, I just can't even I still get chills even thinking about it. And of course, the manager says, "Good job, rookie." And so for a long part of my life, I thought that story was about baseball. That's how I told the narrative, right? It was a baseball story. It really set my career in the right direction, allowed me to get up here to Portland and go to AAA and do some fun things in baseball. But now at this point in my life, that story is about GOP 2.0. It's about having the ability to throw the right pitch, but having the courage to throw it. The reality is Donald Trump has 0% chance of ever being the president of the United States again. He just doesn't, right? History tells us that. And the self-inflicted wounds that we're watching play out every day, all day, are enough to tell us that that's not a reality. And the quicker we as Republicans, including him, takes that medicine and realizes it, the better our chances are at winning the 2024 election for president. It will continue to become more and more obvious to folks across the country that this is an unwinnable strategy. This divisive rancor, this divisive tone that alienates is not a winnable strategy. And we, unfortunately, continue to be in the crosshairs. In Georgia, a few weeks ago, some of you may have seen this, the former president came down to Perry, Georgia, which is it is just the heartland of Trump country. But it's a great bunch of folks, hardworking farmers. Our number one industry is ag. And the former president came down there and had a rally and to support his Trump candidates that are running for statewide office. And at one point, actually at 2 points in that speech, he said that we ought to, as Georgia Republicans, vote for Stacey Abrams instead of Brian Kemp. That was a tectonic shift in the state of Georgia at that very moment, even amongst the most ardent Trump supporters, because that just doesn't make rhyme or reason. Brian Kemp is the most conservative governor in Georgia's history. He's balanced lives and livelihoods to navigate us through a pandemic. He's led us through so many important, tough issues in the 3 years that he's been in office and deserves the right to be reelected. But Donald Trump put on display his pride over his party. And I believe that narrative is going to continue to play out in states all over the country. And when Republicans wake up and realize that their prize fighter in Donald Trump cares more about himself than them, is when the tide begins to change. But all of that with the knowledge of what's happening in DC right now, with what's happening in the White House right now. The Biden administration, I hope this doesn't come across as ultra partisan because and more of just a disappointed American. I don't know if anybody in this country can explain what happened in Afghanistan, justify the moves made, the decisions, the rash nature, the lack of communication with those that were best informed to make those decisions. I don't know if any of us feel comfortable with the runaway inflation models that are running rampant. I know in Georgia, when we go to our kids' games, the number one topic is how expensive it is to operate a small business or run a household. As we talked about a minute ago, nobody can explain the southern border crisis. It is not a good idea to have an open border for about 8 million reasons. And Joe Biden seems to be the only person that thinks that it's a working strategy. I could go on and on and on and on and on. And I almost view this as this Trump-Biden ticket that's beginning to form to work against the common sense conservatives inside the Republican Party. And Republicans aren't making this any easier for ourselves right now, right? The math problems, we're not simplifying it to its lowest common denominator, right? And to quote a great NHL player, Wayne Gretzky, we've got to stop skating to where the puck's at and start skating to where the puck is going. We know what inevitability here. We know what the weight of reality is. There's not going to be this overwhelming groundswell for election fraud and conspiracy theories and a divisive rancor. Republicans are going to wake up across this country and just simply want to win. And I think GOP 2.0 can do that. What we're seeing is a short-term sugar high in Donald Trump. And I guarantee you, just beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Trump fever is going to break. My hope is it breaks quicker sooner than later. I hope it breaks quick enough for us to be able to save face in the 2022 cycle. I hope enough Americans wake up and realize that they need to elect members of Congress and in the U.S. Senate and help those folks become elected. But I'm not certain of that. Certainly, we hope that this happens by 2024. GOP 2.0 wants to be there to pick up the pieces, to really take that leadership role in how we move forward, how we truly, genuinely go back to inspiring a nation instead of talking down to a nation. There's already signs that it's starting to break. We all probably have our own private conversations that are happening where your buddies don't want you to know they actually said what they said. But the way this plays out in my life is multiple times a day, even at the Capitol in Georgia. A friend will come up to me and they'll look both ways to make sure nobody can hear them. They'll put their arm around me and get close enough to where still nobody can hear them. And they'll say, look, Geoff, I'm really proud of you. Thanks for standing up and doing the right thing. This means a lot for this country. This means a lot for this party. Man, I can't wait for the day it's cool to just be honest and I can't wait for my district to come to their senses. It's tough to hear that, but that's reality. And that's happening more and more and more. And it just continues to remind me of this story in my life. I talk about it in the book. It's a very personal issue. I made the decision in my baseball career to not use steroids. I was a product of the late 90s. I was drafted in 1996. And so this was the heyday before all the major league teams cracked down on testing and all of that. And, almost a tremendous number of my teammates and friends made the decision to use steroids. And we would talk about it daily on the bus, on the plane, in the locker room, at the hotels. We would have conversations about it. And it felt like a short-term sugar high, right? It felt like when Brooke and I put this stuff on the scale and we talked about it, it wasn't worth the short-term healthcare issues. It wasn't worth tearing a muscle right out of the gates and ruining a career. Some of my friends are waking up now in their 40s and realizing it wasn't worth it because they can't even play golf or jog anymore because their bodies have fallen apart. And some of my friends feel the short-term sugar high, even despite their careers being super successful and accomplishing all the numbers they wanted. There's an asterisk next to their name and they can only look at the Hall of Fame from the outside looking in. And to me, that feels a lot like these folks that are around me now. I get their stories, right? A lot of my friends took steroids not because they were evil monsters, but because they were trying to feed their families and pay for their mortgage, pay their car payment. A lot of these guys in these rural districts and outside the suburban areas are just trying to win re-election. They're trying to say what helps keep folks off their tail. But the reality is I don't want to see an asterisk mark next to their name in the history books like my friends do. I keep coming back to this motto, and I talk about it in the book on a number of occasions. One of my sons reminded me of it in the thick of the moment when former president was tweeting, crazily at me, was doing the right thing will never be the wrong thing. Right? Doing the right thing will never be the wrong thing. And our three boys that we raise, it just becomes a motto, and you got to live it out. Just imagine if I would have, said, look, there was no rigged election, there was, no conspiracy theories, the Dominion machines aren't rigged, whatever the latest theory or conspiracy of the day was. But then I went on TV that night, and I sat down on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or PBS or any of those channels, and I said something completely opposite. I will have burned the ability to ever have credibility when I look at my kids and tell them to do the right thing, because it will never be the wrong thing. And so whether that's baseball with steroids, whether that's business, family, and even elections, doing the right thing will never be the wrong thing. I'm convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt this is the right pathway forward for the Republican Party. And it's for all the right reasons. And this is the right pathway forward for me. I've made the decision back home, and I've announced it, that I'm not seeking re-election for the job of lieutenant governor. And it's not because I can't win, and it's not because I don't love the job. I really do. I enjoy the job. It's a great job. But I want to have a much needed conversation with America. And if I'm running for re-election and trying to do the things I need to do to win a primary and a general in Georgia, I can't have that conversation. That needs to happen now. Leadership's lonely. Anybody who's ever been in a leadership role knows that leadership is lonely. This is no exception to that, but it's always worth it. And part of that leadership model is hopefully being back in front of you here in New Hampshire on a number of occasions over the next 3 years, talking about the issues that matter, continuing to give you updates on GOP 2.0 and the momentum that we continue to build, because there is momentum. I'm here to give you hope. If you care about a better pathway forward for the Republican Party, that we are gaining momentum. And I hope to come back to the Granite State a number of times and be able to share my stories from around the country and give confidence that we do know what we're talking about. And we do want to have a genuine leadership position, and we do want to have conservative policies rule the land once again. I certainly have to speak no importance to the fact of the first in nation primary process is so important. There's a reason why it matters here, because New Hampshire does such an incredibly good job of separating fact from fiction. The other thing I think that is so important in this process that I continue to hear about is you recognize when somebody's willing to work hard for something. I think hard work is something that is genuine. If you work hard over a long period of time, it's because it matters to you. It's because you're focused on the journey and not necessarily the trophy. And I certainly hope to play a part in trying to be on the front lines of defense to try to build the GOP 2.0 brand right here as we move forward. And make no mistake about it, we intend for GOP 2.0 to play a significant role in shaping who the Republican nominee is here. We also want to work with strong leaders like your governor. Governor Sununu is a strong leader that's continued to balance tone and policy and continue to look for opportunities all over the country to invest in the political future of individuals like him and their career efforts, potentially maybe even seeking a U.S. Senate seat, which we in Georgia know the value of needing to have that U.S. Senate majority as a Republican. And so we'll continue to look all over the country to look for those smart investments that we can continue to make. Look, GOP is not that far away from winning again. With a few course adjustments, with a few sips of medicine, we can be back on the winning track. We can once again have the brand that we're all so proud of. I can't think of a better place to start this journey and to start this movement than right here, right now on this campus. And so it's a great honor to be here today. And hopefully I finished in time for the first pitch for the game if anybody's going home to watch the Red Sox game. But I genuinely want you to hear right from my heart, this is an honor to be here, to be able to start to share this message and this dream, not just for Geoff Duncan, but for America. So thank you so much for the opportunity. And hopefully I left enough time to answer some questions.
I envision that there's going to be some very strong political Republican leaders, maybe yourself included, and you put them in a room, you sit them down, and you say, it's over. Get it through your thick skull, it's over. Because I'm afraid he's going to mess up the next election.
Can I bring you with me? You sound pretty convincing. Look, Yes, I hope that conversation happens. But look, at this point, I think we've got a couple of different angles going on. We got the sore loser angle going on. We've got the he doesn't want to admit that he missed the layup himself. But I think what's going to help get Republicans back on track is that we don't want to lose again. We can't afford to lose again. The Biden administration is taking us in a polar opposite direction from where we want to go, and I believe America wants us to go.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for your words. Thanks for being here. I want to ask you a question on the current state of Georgia politics. You mentioned Governor Kemp, who's in the re-election bid, along with the Senate seat up in Georgia with Senator Warnock's seat. What is your take on that, and how can Republicans re-elect Governor Kemp and then also win back that Senate seat in just a few months? Thank you.
Yeah, it's still hard to believe that we have two Democratic U.S. senators representing us. I mean, just a year ago, we would have never even thought that was a possibility, and here it is. It's a brutal reality. The beginning of the end of that runoff process, unfortunately, was when Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue hired by default Donald Trump as their campaign manager during the runoff. They lost, and that was unfortunate to watch. But now we have a serious problem on our hands. Senator Warnock is working hard in record-breaking numbers. He's raising money. And the former president is trying to weigh in on who our Senate nominee should be for the Republican side. We've got a number of qualified candidates that are out running and beating the streets, Herschel Walker being one of them. I know a lot about Herschel Walker's football career. I know nothing about his politics, nor does any other Republican in the state of Georgia. And if you simply just claim you know Donald Trump, we've proven that a recipe for disaster as a Republican. And so that's going to be a very difficult race and certainly a hyper-focused race. Governor Kemp, I like the way this is shaping up because it doesn't appear to be any sort of viable Republican opposition forming against him. I know the former president has tried to talk everybody and their brother into trying to run against Brian Kemp, but they realize what I realize is he's the most conservative governor in our state's history. He's done an incredible job of navigating us through one of the most difficult periods of time our state may have ever faced, such as getting us through the hate crimes, the civil unrest that we ultimately were able to pass in the Senate, and the governor signed the hate crimes legislation, which was probably one of the most important pieces of legislation I've ever been a part of, that wholesome process, and Brian Kemp was along every step of the way. My encouragement is just, if you care about your business, you care about your family, and you care about your state, vote for Brian Kemp. And I hope enough Georgians wake up and realize that. The recipe for disaster in Georgia is if we try to do the same exact thing we did in the fallout after the election debacle. And I can tell you what that next chapter looks like if we take that avenue.
Thank you for being with us this evening. It's partially a baseball question, but I know you know more than most. The journey for minor leaguers is one of the toughest things in all of baseball, or all of sports. It's really not chronicled to the general public, but I was just curious as to what are some of the things that you learned throughout your career that has translated to your life in politics now?
So I got to do a lot of amazing things in baseball. I spent 6 seasons beating it up in the minor leagues, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. I got to strike out guys that eventually got to the Hall of Fame and give up home runs to people in the Hall of Fame, play with some amazing teammates. I got to do everything. My wife will tell you I forgot one really important thing, and that was to make a lot of money. So the important parts that I took away was the value of hard work, like I mentioned earlier, right? I mean, if you showed up to work, and I wasn't a guy, I wasn't a bonus baby, I wasn't a high draft pick. I had to literally figure out what pitches guys didn't hit, and when I got to the field early, I got my running in. So the value of hard work, but also the value of dreaming. The value of dreaming is something that we miss out on. I dream for a better country, right? That's why I'm standing here today. I get it. There's a million steps. There's hundreds of millions of voters out there that we've got to convince that this is the right pathway forward. But I'm dreaming about it because you know what? It makes sense. It's a good dream. Chasing a dream's worth it. And, I always seem to, for some reason, end up the underdog. And I despise being the underdog. I was a 69th round draft pick. They don't even draft 69 rounds anymore in baseball. I took out a home equity line to start my first business. I won by 55 votes in my first state house race. But I've realized I'm really good at being the underdog because I don't quit dreaming.
My question is just about how do you respond to any Republicans who maybe don't want to give up that Trump base that they have, or that, like you said, that sugar had little wine on to get reelected?
Yeah, I think there's going to be, I talk about this in the book. It's a term called creative grace, right? And half, it's half-hearted, but it's also really, it's a real strategy, right? Don't get mad at them. Just be patient. Sit back and continue to tell those folks exactly what you know and why it matters. I think folks, we're going to arrive at GOP 2.0 and elect a 2.0 candidate to be their nominee in 2024 in 3 lanes. One, there's going to be a bucket full of people like me that just believe it's the best pathway forward, right? Digging into the policies that matter and positively affect Americans' lives, using empathy to grow the size of the tent, and using a better tone that encourages. There's going to be a group of folks that just simply dig into one issue, like the tone issue. Like my mom, she's so over the negative, divisive nature. So those folks are going to show up. But then there's a third bucket that you speak of. They're going to get tired of losing. They're going to get tired of missing layups in the middle of the court with nobody around them to blame on fouling them. It's just that simple. And to me, that's the ultimate strategy. I hope that happens sooner than later. But we're just going to have to stay patient and keep working and putting the best foot forward. This is as true of a grassroots movement as anything that's ever walked into this room before, because the mountain to climb. But it's coming. It'll come. That's a good book you're reading, by the way.
Yeah, I just got it. I was actually reading the back. He talks about tonight, lost majorities. He did a really good job explaining how he planned on regaining the majorities for Republicans that might have stuck Trump the first time, then the second time didn't vote for him. My question is, how does GOP 2.0 plan to reach out to majorities that might not have just been to Republicans, majorities that have they've traditionally belonged to Democrats?
Yeah, I think tone's going to do a lot to that, right? I think that speaking with a positive, uplifting tone that encourages people, as Neil took me around the rooms in the library and just seeing pictures of Ronald Reagan. I mean, I could only imagine how people ran through those wooden doors instead of walking through them when they got done listening to him speak. I think that's part of it. But the other part is the failed strategy and leadership of Joe Biden. I think that's ultimately going to drive people our direction. But we can't be there and just push them away because we don't want to just, speak in common sense terms, speak like we would in our boardrooms or in our ball fields or at our offices or in our break rooms. So I think it's a combination. We've got to deliver those folks that aren't with us, because we got to stop kicking people out that are with us on 8 out of 10 issues. How many people were with us on 8 out of 10 issues that voted for the other team? It's just crazy, right? We need to either, one, talk to them in an encouraging, educated way about what those policy differences are, but then have a longer term strategy to try to talk them into being with us on those issues. And so I think it's two-pronged. Joe Biden's definitely helping GOP 2.0 right now.
I want to quote somebody from your earlier life, and that is Yogi. I feel like listening to you is deja vu all over again. You are saying many of the same things that were in the 2014, the autopsy after the 2012 loss. And the party didn't exactly pay attention to the autopsy. How can you make it different?
Well, it starts right here tonight. It starts by spreading a message of an uplifting strategy that's not just fun and warm and fuzzy, but a viable strategy to help us win and move forward. And you're right, I've read that autopsy, and if we would have just taken even a fraction of those measured steps, we would not be in the situation that we're in today. Look, I genuinely think that I know this is counterintuitive. My wife says I'm an eternal optimist. This divisive tone and this continued pushing the edge. I mean, like the statements made yesterday by former President Trump about Colin Powell. Things just so brash are going to continue to accelerate the move in the right direction here. And oh, by the way, we have to, or else we're going to come in second place again, which is code language for we lost, and we'll write another autopsy. Uh-oh, you got your question written down. That makes me nervous.
Well, it's a two-parter, so.
I'll take a sip of water. Hold on one second.
So there's a lot of young people in here, and you've obviously been successful in running for public office. So the first part of it is, what's your advice for running for public office? And then the second question is, what has been the most rewarding thing about your career in public office?
Great question. So, I'm a competitor by nature. So when I started to run for the state house, You know, it's a district of 56,000 people. I thought, you know, wins and losses, right? That's how you determine success. And I had a very good friend introduce me to another friend, and he sat me down and he said, look, I don't know if you're the right Republican for your district. It's 86% Republican. I don't know if you can give a speech. I don't know if you can raise money. I don't know if you can knock on doors, whatever. But if you make it about the journey and not the trophy, you will win either way. If every room you walk into, they know your heart and soul, they know exactly why you got into the race, then you win. You'll influence people you will never have influenced. And so to me, that's a strategy. I had the opportunity to give the commencement address at Georgia Tech, and that's what I encouraged that room for. Worry about the journey and not the trophy. And you'll be amazed at the things that you accomplish in the minds and the hearts that you change. Going back to your question, right? I'm focused on the journey. I believe the trophy will be there. The second question, I think the most rewarding thing for me is to have been able to work on foster care. I've got a very good friend that has one of the most impactful stories that you've ever heard. He was a foster child for a number of years in his life and really kind of fell into the care of a great family. And he's just done amazing things with foster care. And he opened up my eyes. I mean, I grew up in a loving home. My parents never divorced, you know, just very, very sheltered home. And to be able to do things in Georgia to help foster kids and knowing that with just a few legislative moves, we can help a kid that's trying to find their way. We can better fund their way. We can give them an opportunity that instead of aging out, this is really one of the things we're going to do in this next legislative session. My last one is we're going to focus in on what we do with kids that are aging out of foster care. I mean, imagine if you're 18 years old, and I hope nobody's had this scenario happen in their life, but it's possible. You're 18 years old, and only because your birth certificate says you're 18 years old, the state walks you out to the curb and gives you nothing. You got to figure it out. I certainly wasn't ready for that move. We talk a lot in Georgia about being the #1 state to do business in, and I'm proud of that, and we work hard for that. I want Georgia to be the #1 place to be a foster kid in.
So, I definitely agree that the way forward for the GOP is however, he still seems to have a lot of juice among a lot of Republican people in America. Ideally, but also realistically, where do you see the sort of Trump phenomenon in what you hope the GOP that turns into?
I think it's going to continue the movement towards a shiny object that some folks are going to focus on. By the way, I voted for Donald Trump twice also. I put it on the scale and I said, you know what, the positives outweigh the negatives, and I voted for him twice. But now we're at a point where this is serious. We can't play games. We can't call people names. We're not on the schoolyard. This isn't a fist fight out in the parking lot after school. It's our country. We want to take this seriously. And so I believe that there's going to be folks that do still continue to support Donald Trump. I'm going to be grateful for the Supreme Court that he's installed. I'm going to be grateful for the ability to come in and validate that an outsider change agent can get stuff done quickly. Nobody can ever say that's impossible anymore. But I'm also going to be grateful when he steps aside and lets the Republican Party go back to winning. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. Look forward to being back. God bless everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the college and institute, thank you for your time and thank you for coming. And also,
Thank you. She'll have this filled up by the end of the night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.